In a seemingly ordinary dinner, a woman smiled in silence while everything around her began to crumble without anyone noticing. Before a foreign client, every word spoken seemed harmless, until cruel secrets began to emerge where no one imagined. Trapped in a marriage that had gradually made her invisible, she discovers that very same night a truth capable of changing everything. And without raising her voice, she decides to transform humiliation into strategy, silence into power, and pain into a new beginning. Before diving into this story of betrayal, intelligence, and a turnaround, don't forget to subscribe for more intense reports like this one. The table was set with the same care as always. White flowers in the center, glasses aligned with millimeter precision, plates that were never the everyday ones, only the fine porcelain ones, reserved for occasions when Renata Cavalcanti needed to be more scenery than person. She adjusted the linen napkin for the third time, looked at the clock on the dining room wall, and felt that heavy familiarity that didn't hurt as much as it used to. 12 years teach the body to endure what the soul refuses. Fabio would arrive in 40 minutes. She knew this because his assistant, Patricia, had sent a message confirming the time, not to Renata directly, but to the apartment administration group, where she was included only when there was logistics to resolve. It was a small detail, one of many small details that, added up, formed the portrait of a marriage that had stopped seeing her a long time ago. The apartment was on the 17th floor of a building in Itaim Bibi, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of Faria Lima, Persian rugs, contemporary art on the walls. Everything chosen by a decorator Fabio had hired without consulting Renata. She lived in a space that reflected nothing of herself. Sometimes she walked through the rooms as if visiting a museum. She admired but did not belong. There was a photo of the two of them on a shelf in the living room, from their wedding 12 years ago, taken in a garden in Campos do Jordão where both looked young and genuinely happy. She passed by that photo every day without stopping to look, which she had discovered was her own way of saying something she wasn't ready to say out loud yet. The distance between who they were in that photo and who they had become was so vast that sometimes she felt as if the two in the photo were characters in a story that belonged to someone else. Renata was 41 years old, with shoulder-length black hair and brown eyes that, in recent years, had learned to observe more than speak. A graduate in letters from USP, she had worked as a freelance translator until the marriage took up all the available space in her life, not by Fabio's explicit demand, but by the silent pressure of a routine that gradually swallowed her up. First, it was the events she needed to attend. Then, the trips she needed to organize. Then, the administration of the apartment, the staff, the social commitments. When she realized it, there was no more space for who she had been before. Fabio Cavalcanti was a managing partner of an investment fund manager based in Faria Lima. He was 45 years old, with broad shoulders, the kind of physical presence that filled a room without needing to speak. He was intelligent, articulate, and knew exactly how to be charming when the environment required it. Outside of work, however, he had become a lean version of himself, silent, distant, present, only in body. Renata couldn't pinpoint when this change had begun. It was like trying to identify the exact moment when summer turns to autumn. There is no defined instant, only the late perception of the cold. She went to the kitchen to check the dinner the cook had left ready. Gnocchi with butter and sage sauce, artisanal bread, Belgian chocolate dessert. Fabio liked refined things. Renata had learned over the years to anticipate each of his preferences with the precision of someone studying a text before an exam, not out of love, but out of habit. And there was a cruel difference between those two motivations. While she waited, she sat in the armchair by the window with the notebook she kept discreetly between two design books on the shelf. It was a ruled notebook, small, with a black leather cover worn at the edges. She opened it to a page full of Japanese characters, written with the careful handwriting of someone who practices for pleasure and not by obligation. Hiragana, katakana, and in the last few weeks, the first kanjis. She had started almost by accident, 14 months ago, when she found in an antiquary in Bom Retiro an old introductory Japanese book she had bought back in college and never finished. She reread the first pages, like someone reuniting with a friend she had forgotten. What began as curiosity turned into a nightly ritual. While Fabio slept or stayed in the office late, Renata studied. She installed apps, watched videos, found an online conversation group with native speakers. She had a facility for languages. She had learned English and French in her teens, and Italian had come naturally during a season in Florence that she and Fabio did in the first years of marriage, when there were still things in common between them. Japanese was different. It required more. It asked for an attention that the rest of her life was not receiving, and that, paradoxically, was what held her. She hadn't told anyone. Not her friend Claudia, nor her sister who called every Sunday, nor Fabio, who rarely asked what she did when he wasn't around. The Japanese was hers, entirely hers. In an apartment decorated by someone else, in a life organized around an agenda that was not her own, that notebook represented the only territory she had conquered alone. The elevator beeped in the hallway. Renata closed the notebook, stood up calmly and went to the entrance. She had learned to do this, to compose her expression quickly, to transform what she felt into something neutral before the door opened. It was a defense mechanism she hardly noticed anymore. It was just what time had done to her. Fabio entered with his tie loosened and his cell phone in hand, replying to a message. He didn't look up immediately. He dropped his briefcase on the sideboard, walked through the hallway, and only then looked at her with that nod of the head that had replaced the kiss perhaps 2 years ago. "Dinner is ready," she said. 5 minutes, he replied, already entering the office. Renata went to the window again. Down there, Faria Lima shone with car headlights and the lights of offices still working at that hour. São Paulo never stopped. There was something comforting in that. The city didn't need anyone to keep spinning. She thought, not for the first time, that she would like to be like that too, to spin on her own without depending on anyone to have meaning. That night was like all the others. Dinner in silence, short comments about the market, about traffic, about some commitment the following week. Fabio ate quickly, thanked her mechanically, and went to the office. Renata observed the way he folded his napkin before leaving, a gesture so automatic, so devoid of presence, that she felt for a moment the vertigo of looking at a stranger. It wasn't the first time that feeling had appeared. It was, perhaps, the most intense until then. She stayed at the table for a few minutes after he left. The wine left in his glass cast a reddish reflection on the white tablecloth. Renata thought about things she wasn't allowed to think out loud, about what was left of what they were, about what she had given up without realizing, about how long a person could live as a shadow of themselves before forgetting what it was like to have volume. She collected the dishes, washed her hands, and went to the bedroom with the notebook under her arm. She opened to a blank page and wrote in Japanese a phrase she had learned that week: "Nani mo wakaranai hito ni wa, nani mo oshirarenai." You cannot teach anything to someone who believes they already know everything. She closed the notebook, turned off the light, slept. 3 weeks later, her life would change forever, but she didn't know it yet. The call came on a Thursday morning. While Renata was having coffee alone on the balcony, Fabio had already left before 7, as was customary on days with meetings with foreign investors. She had woken up to the sound of the door closing and stayed in bed for a few minutes looking at the ceiling, mentally counting the hours until the apartment was hers again. That strange and contradictory version of freedom she had learned to value within a marriage that stood more by inertia than by choice. The name on the screen was Patricia, Fabio's assistant. Renata answered with the trained neutrality of someone who had received hundreds of calls like that over the years. "Donna Renata, good morning. Dr. Fabio asked me to confirm your presence at dinner tomorrow night. It will be at Kinoshita in Itaim. He has a commitment with a partner from Tokyo, Mr. Hiroshi Tanaka, from Tanaka Capital. It will be just the 3 of you at the table." Renata left her coffee cup on the balcony railing and looked at the cement-colored sky covering São Paulo that morning. "You can confirm," she said. "Perfect. The doctor also asked me to remind you that the partner does not speak Portuguese or English fluently, so it will be a conversation mostly in Japanese, with an interpreter available by phone if necessary. He would like you to be there at 7:30. "I'll be there." She hung up. She stood still for a moment with the cell phone in her hand, feeling something that wasn't exactly surprise. It was more that feeling when a piece of a puzzle you weren't putting together falls into your lap and suddenly makes sense. Dinner in Japanese, with an interpreter available by phone if necessary. Fabio had scheduled that dinner without even considering that she might understand something. To him, Renata was the decorative wife, the presence that completed the image of a stable and successful man. She would know how to smile at the right time, nod appropriately, and wouldn't get in the way of anything. What Fabio didn't know, what no one knew, was that in the last 14 months Renata had reached a level of understanding of Japanese that went far beyond the basics. She didn't just understand grammatical structures, she had developed listening fluency. That ability to capture not only what is said but how it is said, with all the nuances that the Japanese language carries in its different registers of formality. She had spent entire weeks watching Japanese dramas without subtitles, reading online newspapers from Tokyo, exchanging messages with a private teacher from Osaka she had found on a language exchange platform. Japanese had silently become her second heart language, after Portuguese and alongside the Italian she had learned in Florence. There were nights when she stayed awake until almost dawn, sitting on the office floor with her notebook open and headphones on, repeating the same phrase in a low voice until the intonation was right, and she felt, in that apparently simple exercise, a satisfaction she had forgotten existed. Not the satisfaction of pleasing, of complying, of being in the right place at the right time. The satisfaction of learning, of feeling her own brain building something new with the honest slowness of someone who has no shortcut available. She went to the office she rarely used, opened her laptop, and spent the morning reviewing business and finance vocabulary. Terms she had encountered in recent months in the text she read for pleasure now gained a practical dimension. Mergers, fundraising, portfolio management, confidentiality agreements. If that dinner was about business, she wanted to understand every word. There was no plan. At least not yet. It was just the silent clarity of someone who, after a long time operating in the dark, turns on a light and decides to pay attention. In the afternoon, she called her friend Claudia, who lived in an apartment in Pinheiros and worked as a lawyer specializing in family law. They had known each other since college, when they shared a house in Villa Maddalena and stayed up until dawn, discussing literature and drinking bad tea. Back then, Renata was the more talkative of the two. She had an opinion on everything, laughed loudly, planned trips that sometimes happened, and sometimes just became beautiful stories to tell. Claudia used to say that Renata was the most alive person she knew. She had stopped saying that a few years ago, and neither of them had touched on the subject. Claudia was the only person in the world who knew Renata deeply enough to perceive what was beneath the calm surface. "There's a dinner tomorrow," Renata said without going into details. "I want to talk afterward." "Talk how? Talk like having wine or talk like you're thinking of doing something?" "I don't know yet, but I want you to be available on Saturday." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Claudia knew that tone well, measured, almost clinical, which Renata used when she was processing something big inside. "I will be," she replied. "Call me when you need." The night before the dinner, Renata spent hours with her notebook open, practicing entire phrases in a low voice, sitting on the office floor. There was no anxiety in what she felt. There was something closer to concentration, that quality of attention that precedes an important performance. She had spent entire years preparing to be invisible. Now, for the first time, she was preparing to see. Every phrase she practiced was like sharpening an instrument that had been stored away too long. The blade was intact, it just needed use. She slept reasonably well. She dreamed of the antiquary in Bom Retiro, of the smell of old paper and the faded cover book that had changed the silent course of her days. She woke up before the alarm, with a clarity that was not common on winter mornings in São Paulo. The next day she chose a simple navy blue dress, put on small gold earrings, applied a discreet lipstick. The bathroom mirror returned the image of an elegant and contained woman, exactly what Fabio expected her to be. What the mirror did not show was what had changed inside, a new clarity, a firmness that didn't need volume to exist. She stood still for a second longer than usual, looking at herself with an attention that was not vanity. It was recognition, as if she were confirming the presence of someone who had disappeared for a while and had just returned. The car arrived at 7:15. Fabio came down from the elevator in a dark grey suit, and hair combed with that calculated care of someone who knows they will be observed. He gave her a quick look, said, "Let's go," and walked to the exit. Renata followed him in silence, as always. But this time the silence had a different weight. She was completely present, not to be pleasant, not to fulfill a role, but to listen, to understand, to finally know what was said when they judged her incapable of understanding. The car slid down Faria Lima as the city lit up in the night. Renata looked out the window, saw the reflection of herself superimposed on the avenue lights, and for the first time in a long time felt something she recognized as anticipation, not of what she expected to happen, but of what she was about to discover. Kinoshita was on a quiet street in Itaim Bibi, discreet like all places that cost too much to need a flashy facade. The entrance was marked only by a small dark wooden sign with engraved Japanese characters, and Renata, reading them as she got out of the car, felt a prick of something that could have been irony if it weren't so close to destiny. The characters literally said, "Place of true meeting." The maître received them with a discreet bow and led them to a private room at the back of the restaurant, separated from the main hall by a sliding door in wood and frosted glass. The table was set for 3, with minimalist bamboo arrangements and low candles. The lighting was warm, intimate, the kind of environment designed for conversations that shouldn't be heard by others. Hiroshi Tanaka was already there. He was a man in his late 50s of medium height, with perfectly white hair cut with precision, and a posture that conveyed genuine calm. Not the performative calm of men who learn to look confident, but the kind that comes from within, from someone who spent a long time observing the world before speaking about it. He wore a dark blue suit without a tie, which in the context of a dinner like that was in itself a statement of personality. His eyes were dark and attentive, with that kind of presence that Renata had learned to associate with people who really listen, not who wait for their turn to speak while the other person finishes, but who truly process what they receive before formulating a response. He stood up when they entered and bowed his head with the contained formality Renata had learned to recognize in months of study, the greeting of someone in a position who respects without diminishing themselves. Fabio went right ahead, hand extended, the calibrated smile of someone in charming mode. "Tanaka-san, what an honor to have you in Sao Paulo. I hope the trip was smooth." He spoke in English, with that pragmatic fluency of a global executive. Tanaka also replied in English in a polite but economical tone. There was an exchange of cards, Fabio with the excessive solemnity of someone who had read about Japanese etiquette on a plane trip, and then Fabio turned to Renata. "My wife, Renata. She is here to keep us company tonight." The introduction was exactly what Renata expected. Not "my wife who did this or that." Not Renata, who studied letters and speaks 4 languages. Just "my wife," like someone pointing to a painting on the wall. She smiled with the exact warmth the situation required and bowed her head slightly toward Tanaka. "It's a pleasure to meet you," she said, in English, as was expected. Tanaka looked at her for a second longer than protocol required, with that silent attention very intelligent people have before deciding what to reveal of themselves. Then he bowed his head with courtesy. They sat down. The sommelier appeared. Orders were made. A starter of artisanal gyoza arrived, which no one commented on because the silence of the first few minutes was still being filled with the necessary pleasantries. Fabio led the conversation with ease. Spoke about the Brazilian market, about macroeconomic challenges, about the opportunities he saw for foreign fundraising. Tanaka listened attentively, replied precisely, asked questions that revealed a sophisticated understanding of the local context. It was the kind of conversation Renata had witnessed dozens of times over the years. The same themes, the same cadence, the same signs of calculated deference on both sides. She knew how those conversations worked. First the courtesy, then the probing, and finally, when trust had been sufficiently built, what one really wanted to say. Renata observed. She ate slowly. She took the wine in small sips. She kept an open and serene expression of someone who is present without interfering. The expression she had practiced over years of dinners, exactly like that one. It was when the sommelier left and the door closed that Tanaka changed the language. He spoke in Japanese, naturally, like someone dropping a weight he had carried out of courtesy for the necessary time, and that now, in a closed room with people of presumed trust, could finally be set down. The change was subtle but immediate. The rhythm of the conversation altered, the choice of words became more direct, the formality gained a different texture, no less polite but more real. It was as if English had been a formal suit, and Japanese was what was underneath. "Forgive me, Cavalcanti-san. My English has served well for formal meetings, but I prefer to be more direct in Japanese when the matter is serious. I hope it is not an inconvenience." Fabio nodded with that smile Renata knew by heart, the smile of someone who didn't completely understand but won't admit it. Of course, please feel free. My wife won't understand anything anyway, and we can call the interpreter if necessary." He said this in English, then repeated it in rudimentary Japanese, with intonation errors that would make any native speaker frown. Tanaka didn't frown. He just nodded. Renata didn't move a muscle in her face. Inside she felt something settle, like a drawer that closes in the right slot after years of being stuck. Fabio had just opened, without realizing it, a window she had never asked for, but that somehow she had expected. She wasn't there for any trap. She hadn't arrived at the restaurant with the intention of discovering anything, but now that the window was open, she would simply pay attention. Tanaka began to speak. His voice was low, controlled, and his Japanese was that of Tokyo, formal, clean, with that cadence Renata had learned to follow with ease. He wanted to discuss the terms of an investment partnership. There were numbers, percentages, deadlines. Renata processed each phrase while continuing with the expression of someone admiring the bamboo arrangement in the center of the table. And then Fabio began to speak too, in a visibly studied Japanese, less fluent than Tanaka's, but functional enough for what he intended. And what he intended, Renata realized in the first few minutes, went far beyond a business agreement. There was a tension in Fabio's speech, not of nervousness, but of someone who chose that foreign language exactly for the sense of protection it offered. Like someone speaking in code in a room full of people he judges incapable of deciphering it. Renata placed her fork on the plate with the delicacy of someone who has all the time in the world. She slightly raised her glass of white wine, let her eyes wander around the room with that vague and polished expression that years of social dinners had polished to perfection. On the outside, she was the image of the well-behaved wife who has nothing to do with what the men are discussing. On the inside, she was absolute attention, every syllable being recorded, every pause being weighed, every choice of word being decoded with the precision of someone who had dedicated more than a full year to exactly that. The dinner continued. Courses were exchanged. The conversation went deep. And Renata heard everything. Each word fell inside her with the specific weight of things that, once heard, cannot be undone. She didn't know yet what she would do with what she was listening to. She didn't know if there was a plan, if there was a way out, if there was something that could still be saved, or if she was just confirming what some part of her had already suspected for a long time. What she knew, with a quiet and frightening certainty at the same time, was that she could never again pretend she didn't know. That dinner had taken from her the only resource left to willful ignorance: doubt. The car returned by the same path, but everything had shifted places. Renata sat next to Fabio in the back seat, with the precise care of someone carrying something fragile inside. Not fragile from weakness, but fragile from weight, the kind of thing that, if you move abruptly, might break in the wrong place. He was satisfied. She perceived this in the way he stayed on his cell phone during the journey, replying to messages with that lightness of someone who believes the day ended well. For him, it had ended. The Japanese partner was engaged, the numbers made sense, the dinner had served its purpose. He had spoken with freedom, that specific freedom of someone who believes the chosen language works as walls, and had said what there was to say without the slightest care, without suspecting for a second that there was a second audience in that room. This confidence, Renata thought, as she looked through the car windows at the city's night flow, was the most revealing thing of all. Not what he had said, but how much he had said, how much he had felt safe to say. This said something about how he saw her that none of the words by themselves could say so completely. What Fabio had said at that dinner, in Japanese, while judging he had an audience incapable of understanding him, did not leave Renata's head. The words continued to arrange and rearrange themselves inside her with the insistence of things that do not ask permission to occupy space. He had described her career as a translator, as an activity without practical relevance. He had said that she existed more as a compositional element than as an active partner. He had, with a casualness that still chilled her, mentioned that he maintained another effective commitment, an expression that in Japanese sounded almost bureaucratic, but whose meaning was absolutely clear. And he had touched, obliquely but unmistakably, on financial structures that were not the ones listed in the partnership documents, a layer of resources that, in the conversation with Tanaka, appeared as an operational flexibility margin. She had not reacted, not with her body nor with her expression. She had taken another sip of wine when necessary, had smiled at the moments the context required a smiling woman, had said, "Excuse me," as she stood up to go to the bathroom with the same lightness as always. Inside there was a new silence, not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, but that of someone who is choosing very carefully when and how to say it. The apartment was dark when they arrived. Fabio went straight to the office, as always. Renata went to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and stayed like that for a long time, without turning on the light. She wasn't crying. She was thinking. There was a huge difference between the two things, and she had learned over those 12 years that confusing one with the other was a luxury that cost dearly. The next morning, she woke up before the sun. She prepared coffee, stood on the balcony looking at the still grey city, and did what she had decided to do the night before, in the dark of the bedroom. She called Claudia. "Can you talk?" Renata asked, when her friend answered with the sleepy voice of someone still in bed. "I can. What is it?" "I need to tell you something, and then I need you to help me think." There was a pause. Then the sound of Claudia getting up, the chair dragging, the kettle being put on the fire. "Tell me," she said. Renata told everything. It took 40 minutes. She spoke about the Japanese she had learned in secret, about the dinner, about each phrase she had heard and recorded, about the another effective commitment, and about the financial structures that didn't match what she knew from the partnership documents. She spoke with the precision of someone who had spent the whole night organizing the facts in a logical sequence, because she knew that, when it came to telling, it would be clarity that made the difference. Claudia listened to everything without interrupting once. When Renata finished, there was a brief and dense silence. "Are you okay?" Claudia asked first. "I am whole," Renata replied. "Which is different." "Yes, it's different." Another pause. "Renata, what do you want to do?" "I want to understand what I have, and I want to be prepared before moving anything." "Right." Claudia's voice had changed register, out of friend mode into lawyer mode, which was what the situation required. "Do you have access to the fund manager's financial documents, statements, partnership agreements, anything that shows movements outside the pattern?" "I have access to some things, not everything. Start with what you have. Don't move anything, don't touch anything that might look like you've been snooping. Just observe and document, and don't talk to anyone besides me." "Understood." "And the Japanese," Claudia said with an inflection Renata couldn't immediately classify. "How long were you keeping that?" 14 months. My God. There was something that could have been admiration or shock, or both at the same time. "You are the most disciplined person I know, Renata." "Or the loneliest," she replied, with a lightness that surprised even herself. Claudia was silent for a second. Then she said more slowly, "Listen, you're going to need more than words heard at a dinner. That's your account, and an account has weight, but it's not enough. What you need is a trail, paper, number, record. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "I understand. And one more thing. You're not doing anything wrong by looking at what is within your reach inside your own home. But if you need anything beyond that, you call me before moving anything. Deal?" "Deal." The sun had risen enough to gild the tops of the Faria Lima buildings. Renata stood looking at that for a moment, that specific early morning light that São Paulo rarely offers, the color of honey diluted over concrete, which seems less like a promise than a reminder that the day exists regardless of what one does with it. Then she went to the office, opened the drawer where Fabio kept the documents he considered too irrelevant to lock, old statements, reports from previous periods, printed formal correspondence that no one else printed anymore, but that he kept out of a habit he had never explained, and began with calm and method to read. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but she had learned in those 12 years alongside a man who lived by numbers that financial documents speak to those who have the patience to listen to them, and she had patience. She had, perhaps, more patience than anything else at that moment. She spent 2 hours at the drawer. She found statements for an account she didn't recognize. It wasn't in the fund manager's name, nor in Fabio's name, but the amounts and dates created a pattern that someone with less attention might have ignored. There were also a series of printed emails from a generic address account containing references to allocation adjustments in projects she had never heard Fabio mention. Nothing was conclusive alone, but together, like pieces scattered on a table that begin to suggest the image before it's complete, there was something there that didn't add up. She photographed everything with her cell phone, slowly, without rushing. Then she replaced each sheet exactly where she had found it, in the same order, with the same degree of disorder that Fabio considered tidy. She closed the drawer. She washed her hands as if she had touched something that needed care. And she went to make more coffee because the day was still long, and she had learned, a long time ago, that important decisions require lucidity, not urgency. The following days were of an apparent normality that Renata sustained with the same rigor she had sustained everything else in recent years. She woke up, prepared coffee, saw Fabio off when he left, managed the apartment, confirmed commitments, replied to messages. The external routine remained intact, and that was exactly what she needed it to be. Fabio hadn't changed at all. He arrived late, ate quickly, disappeared into the office, slept without conversation. To him, the dinner with Tanaka had been a success, and success made people careless in ways they rarely perceived. Beneath the surface, however, there was a constant and silent movement that didn't stop for a second. She had created a folder on the old laptop she used for her Japanese studies, a machine Fabio never touched, that he didn't even know for sure where it was kept. In this folder, she organized the photographs of the documents, added her own notes with dates, values, and connections she had identified, and kept adding other discoveries as the days passed, and she found more material. It wasn't an investigation in the dramatic sense of the word. It was more like attentive listening. The same kind of attention she had applied to Japanese, now directed at the patterns Fabio left behind without noticing. There was something curiously familiar in that. The same patience she had developed to distinguish formal Japanese registers from informal ones, the same ability to recognize when a grammatical construction carried a different weight than it appeared, was now being used to read financial documents with a layer of meaning that wasn't on the surface. Both skills had been built in the same silence, with the same invisible time. The difference was that one had stayed in the notebook, and the other was now in a password-protected folder only she knew. She found more things. A lease agreement for an apartment at an address she recognized as being in Jardins. Not by the street name, but by the reference that appeared in an email exchange Fabio had left open one afternoon when she had stopped by the office to get a charger. At the time, she had closed the laptop without reading, with that reflex of someone who learned that seeing certain things has a cost one isn't always willing to pay. Now, reconstructing that memory with new eyes, she understood exactly what she had seen. The apartment wasn't hers, and the name on the signature line of the contract she had found among the papers in the drawer was not any collaborator of the fund manager she knew. It was a female name, Short, which she repeated mentally once, twice, and then stored away. Claudia came to the apartment on a Wednesday afternoon with the excuse of a lunch that was perfectly believable to anyone who might be watching. They sat in the kitchen with coffee and the photographs open on the laptop. Claudia went through each image with the attention of someone who reads contracts for a living, slowly, going back when necessary, without commenting while processing. When she finished, she closed the laptop carefully and sat looking at the table for a moment. "What you have here," she said, choosing her words with precision, "is enough to sustain an internal investigation at the fund manager. It's not definitive proof of anything in isolation, but the whole creates a pattern that any serious compliance sector would be obliged to investigate." "And for the divorce?" Claudia looked up. "For the divorce, what matters is the real composition of the assets. If there are resources that are not declared in the marital partnership, that is concealment of assets. What you have is a very solid start for an accounting audit. But we need one more element, confirmation that the Jardins apartment is linked to him in some way that can be proven." Renata went to the kitchen drawer, opened it, took out a small envelope and placed it on the table. Claudia opened it. Inside was a printed statement for an account Renata had found the previous day, in an envelope that had arrived by mail addressed to the fund manager but had been delivered to the apartment by mistake. The monthly debit amount corresponded exactly to the rent value of a high-end property in the neighborhood. Claudia looked at the statement. Then she looked at Renata. "Where did you find this?" "It arrived by mail. The delivery guy got the address wrong. I signed for it without knowing what it was, opened it like I would any mail addressed to the apartment, and saw it." "And is it true?" "It's true." Claudia folded the statement carefully and put it back in the envelope. "This here, added to what you already have, changes the weight of the conversation significantly." Renata poured more coffee for both without saying anything. There was a stillness between them that wasn't discomfort. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people are facing something that has real gravity and choose to respect it before continuing. "When do you want to move?" Claudia asked. "When it's complete, not before." "What's missing?" Renata thought for a moment. "I want to be sure about something I heard at dinner. He mentioned a side negotiation with a group from Singapore. He used an expression that in Japanese can mean both informal agreement and unregistered structure. I want to know which of the two it was before handing anything over to the fund manager's compliance." Claudia nodded slowly. "Do you still have contact with anyone inside the company?" "I have Patricia, who calls me every week without imagining that I pay attention to anything besides the dinner time." Renata paused briefly. "In the last call, she mentioned that Fabio is traveling to Singapore in 3 weeks, a meeting that isn't on the shared calendar. When I asked about it, casually as always, Patricia was silent for a second before replying that it was a last-minute commitment. That 1-second silence told me more than any answer she could have given." Claudia looked at her with an expression that was simultaneously professional admiration and something more personal, deeper. "Were you always like this? This way of hearing things between the lines?" Renata thought about the answer honestly. "I was taught to be invisible, and whoever is invisible learns to observe because it's the only thing left." The two fell silent again. Outside, São Paulo made its constant and indifferent noise. Renata looked out the window at the irregular line of rooftops and buildings she had observed so many times without really seeing. There was something different about looking at the city now, as if she herself had changed position, and the landscape, being the same, looked different. "Claudia," she said, without taking her eyes off the window, "do you think I should have left earlier?" Her friend took time to reply. When she spoke, it was with the honesty of someone who respects the person enough not to sugarcoat it. "I think you left when you were ready, and being ready makes all the difference between leaving empty-handed and leaving with your head held high." Renata nodded once, slowly. There was something liberating in that sentence she couldn't completely explain, not because it undid the weight of what she had discovered, but because it accurately named what had changed. It wasn't what she knew now. It was what she was capable of doing with what she knew. Those were two completely different places, and she had reached the second in a way that couldn't have happened otherwise. Then she went back to the laptop and opened the notes folder. There was still work to do, but for the first time in a long time, working didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a choice. Fabio's trip to Singapore was confirmed by Patricia on a Tuesday morning, with the naturalness of someone fulfilling an administrative task. He would leave on a Thursday, return on Monday. 4 days. Renata mentally noted every detail of the call, not just what was said but what wasn't. No mention of the specific reason for the trip, no name of a client or company, no hotel that Patricia usually mentioned, so Renata would know where to contact Fabio in emergencies. That omission, so different from previous calls about work trips, had a specific texture. It was the silence of someone who had been instructed not to give details, not the silence of someone who simply forgot. The detail was small. What it revealed was not. On Wednesday afternoon, while Fabio packed his suitcase in the bedroom with that distant efficiency of someone who has done this alone for years, Renata stayed in the living room, leafing through a magazine she wasn't reading and paying attention to the movement with the sharpness of a tuned radar. He made 2 quick calls in English, short, functional, without anything that revealed more than the controlled tone of someone managing multiple plans at the same time. At one point, he laughed softly at something the other person had said. A laugh Renata recognized as different from a business laugh, more relaxed, more personal, the kind of laugh someone reserves for someone they truly know. She continued leafing through the magazine without turning the page. When he left, he said, "I'll call you from there," with the automaticity of a phrase that had lost its meaning long before it stopped being said. Renata stood in the living room for a moment after the door closed. Then she went to the bedroom, opened his closet and checked with careful attention what he had taken. Business clothes, yes, but also something she had never seen in his suitcase for work trips, a bottle of the perfume he only used on weekends when they were in informal social situations. Such a small detail, so revealing. She closed the closet, went to the laptop. In the next 48 hours, Renata worked with a concentration she hadn't felt since her college days, when she stayed up late to finish poetry translations that no one paid well for, but that she did with the care of someone who believes that what is done with words has real consequences in the world. She organized all the documentation she had gathered in chronological order, created a clear index, added explanatory notes that anyone from the outside could follow without needing previous context. There was something almost therapeutic in that, not in the soft sense of the word, but in the precise sense. She was reorganizing, with method, a reality she had lived in a fragmented way for years. Each document that went into the folder was a fragment that found its place. She sent everything to Claudia in encrypted parts, according to the protocol her friend had established. On Friday afternoon, Claudia came to the apartment again. This time she also brought a colleague, Marcello, a forensic accounting specialist she had worked with on other cases. He was a middle-aged man, calm, with glasses slipped to the tip of his nose and the kind of attention in his eyes of someone who spent decades learning that numbers always tell a story if you know where to look. He arrived with a thin folder and a small bottle of water, sat down with the naturalness of someone who has been at dozens of tables like that, and who had long ago learned not to let the environment affect the quality of the analysis. Renata liked him immediately. There was something reassuring in the practical seriousness of someone who treats facts as facts, without drama and without sugarcoating. They sat at the dining room table, the same table with the white flowers and the aligned glasses, and Renata presented what she had gathered with the clarity of someone who rehearsed, but not with the rigidity of someone who memorized. Marcello analyzed in silence. He made some notes, asked to see 2 specific photos again. Then he took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and said, with the verbal economy of someone who learned not to use unnecessary words, "There is a structure here that is not compatible with the fund manager's public records. If what is in these images corresponds to what is in the internal systems, there is a relevant discrepancy that any audit would identify." He lightly tapped his finger on the table, indicating one of the photos. "This value here, combined with this time frame here, suggests an allocation that does not appear in any of the quarterly reports I was able to access publicly. Someone was careful, but not careful enough." "Is it enough to trigger compliance?" Claudia asked. "With this basis, yes. They would be obliged to investigate." Renata looked at the 2 of them. "I want to understand something before any movement. If I trigger the fund manager's compliance, What happens to the partnership with Tanaka? Marcelo and Claudia exchanged a quick look. It was Claudia who replied, "It depends on what the investigation finds. If the partnership is clean, if Tanaka has no involvement in the irregularities, it probably survives. The fund manager will want to maintain the relationship with the foreign partner, even if it needs to deal with the internal situation." Renata was silent for a moment. There was something in that answer she needed to process carefully, not out of insecurity, but because she understood she was at a fork in the road and wanted clarity on what each path implied before taking any step. She had learned in Japanese and in life that the haste to act before completely understanding was the most common and most expensive mistake a person could make. She also understood that, once the process was triggered, control over the pace of things would partially belong to others, to the fund manager, the lawyers, the procedures. She wanted to be absolutely sure of what she was putting in motion before letting it go. "So I can separate things," she said. "The compliance issue is one thing, the divorce is another, and Tanaka is a third." "Exactly," Claudia confirmed. "They are distinct processes that can run in parallel. The important thing is the order and the timing." That night, after Claudia and Marcelo left, Renata stayed alone in the living room with tea that went cold before she finished it. She looked at the city outside, São Paulo in its Friday night version, noisy and indifferent as always, and had that strange and clean feeling of someone about to cross a border from which there is no return. It wasn't fear. It was the seriousness of someone who understands the weight of what they are doing and decides to do it anyway, not out of dramatic courage, but out of the simple and definitive absence of any other option she could respect. She thought about how she had reached that point, not through a single betrayal revealed in an instant, but through a slow accumulation of erasures, each one too small to justify a reaction, large enough to leave a mark. It was the sum of them that had reached the limit, and the dinner at Kinoshita had been just the moment the sum became visible. She picked up her cell phone, opened Claudia's contact, typed a short message, "I'm ready. Let's schedule for Monday." She sent it, placed the cell phone on the table, finished the cold tea. On the other side of the window, São Paulo continued spinning, and Renata, for the first time in 12 years, was spinning along, not at someone else's rhythm, but at her own. Fabio returned from Singapore on Monday at noon, tanned in a way that didn't match 4 days of meetings in an enclosed environment, and with that specific lightness of someone who just spent time with someone they like. He left his suitcase in the hallway, asked for sparkling water, briefly commented that the trip had been productive, and went to the office without asking any questions about how her 4 days had been. It wasn't malice. It was habit. And perhaps, Renata thought, habit was worse than malice because at least malice requires attention. She observed everything with the calm attention of someone who has already passed the point where these pieces of information hurt. There was no anger. There was only the quiet confirmation of what she already knew, arriving in the physical form of a man with the relieved smile of someone who believes he returned home without leaving a trace. That same afternoon, Claudia had triggered, on Renata's behalf, the fund manager's compliance sector. Through a formal and anonymous channel Marcelo had identified as the correct path. The documentation package was delivered in a complete, indexed form, with explanatory notes. It contained nothing speculative, only what had been found, organized, and which any trained analyst would be capable of interpreting. It was the kind of complaint that doesn't ask for investigation. It is an investigation in itself. Simultaneously, Claudia had filed the initial papers for the divorce process at a notary's office in a preliminary version that had not yet been notified to Fabio, just registered with date and protocol. The timing had been calculated with precision. Both movements should reach Fabio with less than 24 hours difference before he had time to react to one without knowing about the other. Renata spent Monday afternoon in Pinheiros at Claudia's apartment, drinking coffee and waiting. There was no anxiety in what she felt. There was that dense and quiet quality of the weight of someone who has already done everything possible and now recognizes that the rest belongs to time. Fabio's call arrived at 7:42 p.m. She saw the name on the screen and let it ring twice before answering. Renata. His voice had a texture she had never heard before, not anger, not yet, but that tension of someone who just received information that disorganized everything and is still trying to find their feet. "I need to talk to you." "You can talk." "Not over the phone." "Are you at home?" "No." A pause. "Where are you?" "That's not relevant now, Fabio." Another pause, longer. She imagined him in the apartment's office, standing up, trying to calculate what she knew and how much. It was the kind of calculation he did well in a professional context. In a personal context, he was unprepared, because he had never considered her an element that needed to be calculated. "Compliance called me today," he said. "Someone sent documentation." "I understand." "Do you know who it was?" Renata was silent for a second. Then she said, with a calm that wasn't coldness but precision, "It was me." The silence on the other side lasted the exact time it takes for a person to realize the ground they believed firm was, in fact, something completely different. "What are you doing?" he said finally. His voice had changed again, lower, more contained, the tone of someone trying to control something that had already gone out of control. "I'm being honest," she replied, which is something that didn't happen much in this house. "Renata, the divorce papers were also filed today. You will receive the notification in the next few days." More silence. She heard the sound of a chair being pulled, of someone sitting down with the weight of a situation they hadn't foreseen. "Aren't you going to give me a chance to explain?" She thought about that question honestly before answering. There was, somewhere very deep, a part of her that recognized that explanations exist, that people are complex, that rarely does any story have only one side. She respected that complexity, but there was also a clarity that was neither anger nor bitterness. It was simply the recognition that certain things, once said in Japanese, in an Italian restaurant, while believing the wife doesn't understand anything, are not the kind of thing an explanation undoes. He had described her life as irrelevant at that dinner. He had said she existed as an ornament. He had mentioned, with the bureaucratic lightness of someone talking about a line in the budget, that he had another effective commitment. And he had done all this while she sat at the same table, 3 meters away, with the correct smile on her face. "You had 12 years to be honest with me," she said, "and you chose not to be. I would need the explanation to undo that, and it won't." She hung up. She held the cell phone in her hand for a moment. Then she placed it on Claudia's table and looked at her friend, who had stayed on the other side of the room respecting the space of that conversation, with the discretion of someone who understands that certain crossings need to be made in solitude, even when someone dear is nearby. "It's done," Renata said simply. Claudia nodded. "How are you?" Renata thought about the real answer, without the automatic filter of someone used to saying, "I'm fine," when not asked with real intent. She made an honest assessment of what she felt, the internal trembling that didn't reach the surface, a kind of lightness accompanied by dizziness, like someone taking off a very heavy coat after a long time, and feeling both relief and the strangeness of their own body without that weight. "I am whole," she said, trembling inside, but whole. "That's enough," Claudia said. And it was. In the following days, Fabio tried to contact her multiple times. Calls Renata didn't answer, messages she read without replying, not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing to reply that wouldn't be repeating what had already been said. He went to the apartment one afternoon. She wasn't there. She had gone out on purpose to walk in Ibirapuera, with the only thought that lungs need air and feet need ground, sometimes more than the head needs an answer. He left a note she found on the sideboard. "We need to talk, please." She folded the note, kept it in a drawer he wouldn't open, and went to prepare dinner for herself for the first time in a long time, without calculating what someone else preferred. She made pasta with garlic and oil, ate slowly with a book open next to the plate, and thought it was the most honest meal she had had in years. The fund manager's compliance had started the formal investigation. Claudia had been contacted by the company's lawyers, as was expected. The process ran in institutional silence, the kind that precedes the most significant storms. Renata didn't need to do anything else on that front. She had set the gear in motion, and now it followed its own rhythm. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew yet, was that the most unexpected chapter of the story was still to come, coming from a place completely different from where anyone could have predicted. The email arrived on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the call to Fabio, while Renata was at Claudia's apartment, where she had temporarily settled while the divorce proceedings advanced and the E-Time apartment was still legally shared. It was an address she didn't immediately recognize, Tanaka.h followed by a Japanese corporate domain. She read the subject twice before opening. It was written in English, for Mrs. Renata Cavalcanti, a personal matter. She opened it with the contained attention of someone who has already learned that the world's surprises rarely arrive announced. The email was from Hiroshi Tanaka. It was written in Japanese, impeccable, formal, of the register used for communications of genuine respect, and began with an apology for the intrusion. He had obtained her address through a professional search, which he recognized was unusual, and asked her to consider reading the message to the end before deciding how to respond. Renata read. Tanaka wrote that he had noticed during the dinner at Kinoshita something that had bothered him ever since. It hadn't been just the content of the conversation with Fabio, it had been her. The way she had remained motionless and serene while hearing things that he was sure she had fully understood. He had identified the recognition in her eyes when certain words were spoken, the specific quality of attention of someone who is processing a language, not just sitting in its presence. It was something only someone who had spent many years alongside people who pretended not to understand Japanese could recognize. And he had. The son of a diplomat learns early to distinguish between those who don't understand and those who prefer not to reveal they understand. And Tanaka had spent his entire childhood observing this distinction in the reception rooms of the Japanese Foreign Service. He also wrote that, in the weeks following the dinner, he had done his own investigations into the fund manager and into Fabio, and that what he had found had led him to a conclusion that made any commercial partnership impossible. Tanaka Capital had formally withdrawn interest in the negotiation. This, he made sure to clarify, had no relation to her. It had to do with the integrity he required from any business relationship, without exception. But there was a second part to the email. Tanaka wrote that, in 30 years heading Tanaka Capital, he had learned to identify people with real capacity in a way different from declared capacity. There was something in the way she had behaved at that dinner, the intelligence of self-control, the discipline of listening, the ability to process complex information in real time without letting anything show, that corresponded to a profile he had searched for years for a specific project. Tanaka Capital was expanding operations to Brazil and needed someone to function as a cultural and linguistic bridge with real depth in both cultures, not just technical fluency. Someone who understood what wasn't said as much as what was. He wasn't offering charity. He was offering a concrete professional opportunity with remuneration and scope detailed in an attached document because he had identified in her a competence that the market had not yet seen. Probably he wrote with a delicacy she recognized as sophisticated because no one had bothered to look. Renata stared at the screen for a long time after finishing. There was something in the email that went beyond the offer itself. There was the recognition of someone who had paid attention, not to the version of herself she had been forced to present at that dinner, not to the role of the well-behaved wife who doesn't interfere, but to the person who had truly been present, working in silence beneath the surface, using as an instrument exactly what everyone had discarded as irrelevant. Then she went to the window of Claudia's apartment, which looked out onto a tree-lined street in Pinheiros, with that morning light that makes the leaves look freshly washed, and stood there without thinking of anything specific. It was the kind of pause the body asks for when it receives information too big to process in motion. It needed stillness for the pieces to settle in the right place. Claudia appeared at the living room door with 2 cups of coffee. She read Renata's expression with the precision of someone who has known her for 20 years. "What is it?" Renata turned around. "Do you remember Tanaka, the Japanese partner from the dinner?" "I remember. He sent me an email." Claudia crossed the room, handed over one of the cups, and stood next to her looking at the street. "And?" "He noticed that I understood Japanese that night. noticed, and said nothing. Renata paused. And now he's offering me a job. The silence that followed was the kind that asks to be respected. Claudia respected it. Then she said, "And are you going to accept?" Renata thought about the answer with the care it deserved. She thought about the faded book from the Bom Retiro antiquary, the nights on the office floor with the notebook open, the hours watching Japanese dramas without subtitles while the city slept and Fabio stayed in the bedroom without asking what she was doing. She thought about 14 months of work no one had asked for, that no one had rewarded, that she had done solely because something inside her needed a space that was hers alone. And she thought about how that space, cultivated in silence, had become, without her planning, without her knowing she was building anything beyond a refuge, the most real thing she possessed. "I'll read the attachment first," she said. "But yes, I think I will." Claudia gave a small smile that didn't need words. Then she took a sip of coffee and said almost to herself, 14 months of Japanese. 14 months, Renata confirmed. They went to the table. Renata opened the attachment. It was a 4-page document, detailed, professional, with scope, remuneration, and work structure, described with the clarity of someone who doesn't make offers on impulse. She read every line attentively. When she finished, she closed the laptop, sat looking at the table for a moment, and then began to draft the reply. She wrote in Japanese. Clear, clean, in the register of someone who knows the language deeply, not with the forced fluency of someone who studied for a meeting, but with the naturalness of someone who inhabited that language from the inside, in their own dreams and notes and daily reflections. On the nights when the city slept and she stayed awake in an apartment that wasn't hers, learning to be herself in a language no one expected her to know. She thanked him for his attention, confirmed her interest, proposed an in-person meeting for the following week. She sent it. She kept her hands on the keyboard for a second after pressing send. There was something she wanted to fix in that moment, not to keep as a victory, but because it was a turning point that deserved to be recognized. She hadn't reached there, despite what she had gone through. She had reached there because of everything she had chosen to do, while the rest of her life went on without seeing her. Because of the nights on the office floor with the open notebook. Because of the hours of Japanese drama without subtitles, the online conversation group with the teacher from Osaka, the Bom Retiro antiquary, where everything had started with a faded book and a small decision that had grown in silence until it had roots deep enough to sustain a whole person. No one had asked her to learn Japanese. No one had recognized the effort. No one had seen. And it was exactly that, the absolute invisibility of that work, that had kept it pure, whole, without the distortion of external expectation or approval. She had done it for herself, in the only space that had resisted erasure. And that space had revealed itself, with time and with the right circumstances, as the most solid space she possessed. That was the instant the silence turned into voice. 6 months later, Renata Cavalcanti sat at the head of a meeting table on the 22nd floor of a building on Brigadeiro Faria Lima Avenue and conducted, in fluent Japanese, a negotiation between Tanaka Capital and a group of Brazilian investors that had taken months to structure. There were 3 people in the room who didn't understand Japanese, 2 who understood partially, and Hiroshi Tanaka beside her with the quiet attention of someone who had confirmed weeks before that he had made the right choice. Renata spoke with the confidence of someone who is not translating just words. She was translating intention, context, the space between what is said and what is meant to be said, which in any international negotiation is where agreements truly happen or fail to happen. She had spent the previous days preparing specific glossaries, studying the sector's technical terms, with the same attention she had given to the first pages of hiragana, and the work had been worth every hour. When the meeting ended with a signed agreement, Tanaka looked at her for a second and said, "In Japanese only, yoku yarimashita. Well done." She replied with a nod that contained more than professional acceptance. It contained the recognition of an entire path that had reached that point through ways no one had mapped with her. The divorce had been finalized 3 months earlier. The division of assets had resulted in enough financial stability for her to have the time and space to establish her new life without the pressure of urgency. She had rented a small, bright apartment in Pinheiros, 15 minutes from Claudia, with a large window in the bedroom that faced east, and which, on clear mornings, let in a light that woke her up before the alarm, with the specific feeling that the day was hers. She had set up the space with the things she had chosen: books, a good table to work at, an armchair near the window, plants she sometimes forgot to water but that endured anyway, with the silent persistence of things that don't need constant attention to keep growing. There were no white flowers on the living room table. There were no aligned glasses. There was a clay fruit bowl she had bought at a Bom Retiro fair, irregular and beautiful, which didn't match anything and which was, for that very reason, perfect. Fabio had been dismissed from the fund manager after the conclusion of the internal investigation, which had confirmed the irregularities identified in the documentation. She had not followed the details of that process closely, not out of indifference, but because she had reached a point where his movements no longer occupied the center of any of her questions. It was a strange and clean freedom, this not needing to know anymore. There was a time when she had organized her own existence entirely around the existence of another person. Now she had learned, with difficulty and with relief, that her own existence was interesting enough to occupy the center. In her work with Tanaka Capital, she had found something she didn't expect: not just competence being recognized, but the pleasure of working in an environment where the precision of language was taken seriously, where words were treated as what they are, instruments with weight, with consequence, with the capacity to build or undo understanding between people who might otherwise never truly meet. Tanaka had revealed himself to be a demanding and fair boss, the kind of person who doesn't praise for nothing but who, when he says something is right, says it because it is. She had learned, in the first few weeks, to read his rhythm the same way she had learned to read Japanese, with attention to the pauses as much as to the words, with respect for the structure without losing the ability to improvise when necessary. It was the most stimulating work she had ever had. It was also, she gradually realized, the work for which she had prepared without knowing, with every hour of study, every night of practice, every choice to pay attention when it would have been easier to give up. It was what she had studied in college, what she had practiced in the poetry translations that no one paid well for, what she had found again in the Japanese she had learned in secret. Everything that had been called irrelevant had revealed itself, over time, as the center. She had also resumed on weekends literary translations. She was working on a short story by a contemporary Japanese writer Tanaka had mentioned in an informal conversation, a story about a woman who spends years cultivating a garden that no one visits, and who one day realizes that the garden was the only place where she had been completely honest with herself. She had read the original 3 times before starting to translate, because she wanted to understand not just what the text said, but what it knew, that deeper layer that is not in the words but between them, which a good translation carries and a hurried translation leaves behind. She had talked about the story with the teacher from Osaka, who had been silent for a moment before saying that Renata had understood the most difficult thing, that translating is not transporting words from one place to another, it is reconstructing an interior state in a new language without losing what makes that state true. On a Saturday afternoon, with the window open and the soft sound of Pinheiros coming through the screen, she was in the armchair with the notebook on her lap, not the black leather notebook worn at the edges, which she had kept on a shelf like one keeps something that fulfilled its purpose and deserves rest, with the dignity of someone who was useful in the right way at the right time, but a new one, with a green cover, with blank pages that had not yet received anything besides a date and a line she had written on the first day. Everything that was done in silence has the same weight as what was done out loud. She was writing in Japanese the first sentence of the translation. She wrote slowly, with attention, with the care of someone who knows that the first words of a story define the tone of everything that comes after, and that this tone, once established, carries the reader to the end, without them noticing they are being carried. The sentence said, "Nani mo miete nakata to omoteta hito ga, jitsu wa ichiban yoku mite ita." The person everyone thought saw nothing was, in fact, the one who saw the most. She reread it, adjusted a particle, reread it again, She was satisfied. Outside, São Paulo made its eternal and indifferent noise. Inside, there was silence. Not the empty silence of before, which was absence and erasure, but the full silence of someone who is present, whole, in the place they chose. It was a silence she had learned to recognize in the last few weeks as the texture of life when it is being lived at the right pace, not too fast, not too slow, but in the step that belongs to someone going to a place that makes sense. It was a silence that sounded inside like Japanese. Renata closed the notebook, looked out the window, and smiled at no one in particular. It was enough. It was, in fact, much more than enough. End of story. If Renata's story touched something in you, if you've ever felt invisible in a place where you should be seen, or if you've ever carried a secret that was, deep down, the most alive thing you possessed, then you know that these stories are not just entertainment. They are mirrors, and that is exactly why we continue to tell them. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, this is the moment. Every week we bring new narratives with this same care, this same emotional investment, so that you don't have to face alone the questions that only stories know how to ask. Leave your like, because it tells us that it's worth continuing. And in the comments, tell us, which part of Renata's story stayed with you? The answer might surprise even you. Until the next story, which is already being prepared with the same patient silence with which Renata learned Japanese.